All right, guys. So my first special guest tonight is Camilla Moore. She's an attorney and she is the chairperson for the California Reparations Task Force. So Camilla, thank you so much for coming on for this, I think, much needed discussion tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor and I'm excited for the discussion.
All right. So first and foremost, I want you to explain to everyone, because I think we've talked about reparations before on the show, and there have been some misunderstandings about what reparations actually is. I think some people think it's just based on skin color, and it's not. Could you please explain to everyone a little bit about what reparations actually is and why we need to have that in this country?
Yes. So when I think about reparations, particularly in the context for the institution of slavery, the United States perpetuating the institution of slavery, including the transatlantic slave trade and the afterlife, or the badges and incidents of slavery, I tell people, I describe reparations for slavery and its badges and incidents as a sacred political project that actually started with the enslaved themselves. People, human beings like Belinda Sutton, Callie House, and Isaiah Dickerson, for instance. These were formerly enslaved people who mobilized, in the instance of Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson, created one of the largest grassroots and mutual aid organizations for the sole purpose of, helping the newly freed slaves, but also, lobbying the federal government for a pension or reparations for those nearly 4 million newly freed slaves in this country. And that is a debt that's owed, right? And so, the descendants of those slaves, African Americans, we are, carrying the torch to achieve, this sacred political project that started with our ancestors. So yes, reparations not only acknowledges the debt that's owed to our ancestors for over 250 years of free labor, but it's also to account for, the governments, from federal, state to local governments, complicity in perpetuating the badges and incidents of slavery that still linger on and impact slave descendants.
That's right. So I want to go ahead and share this about the California Reparations Task Force, because you guys are doing like really great work there. I mean, they just announced that there's going to be a reparations task force in Boston as well. So I think your efforts in California has gotten the message going to other states to consider to start doing this as well. But it says California is the first state in the nation to implement legislation that mandates the study and development of reparation proposal for African Americans, with a special consideration of African American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. So in reference to the task force, so to speak, because I don't want people to get confused. Mm-hmm. This is basically a project, or the task force, so to speak, is basically to fight for it, to push for it, but you guys can't actually sign anything into law.
Right. So the California Reparations Task Force, we're an official state board and commission. We are a legislative advisory body. So you're completely correct. We do not have the power to, turn our final proposals into law. So we definitely don't have the power to enact any legislation into law. We are 9 members, volunteers, California citizens who were appointed to the state board and commission because of our different areas of expertise and interest to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. It'll be up to the California state legislature when we turn in our final report to them in June 30th, 2023, to turn our final proposals into actual legislation. And then it'll be up to either the governor of the state to sign our legislation into law, or depending on the proposals, some of these proposals will end up on the California ballot.
And it says here, the task force scope and powers as a legislative advisory body are predicted on AB-3121, a statute authored by the California Secretary of State, Shirley Weber, and signed into law by California Governor Gavin Newsom in September 2020. So you guys have been working on this for a while.
Yes, we had our first hearing June 2021. We're a 2-year effort. And so the task force sunsets in the next 6 months or so, June 30th of 2023.
Awesome. Expert witnesses for the September hearing included Beth Gorman, who is a grandmother of poet Amanda Gorman. If you guys remember, she was the young woman that read the poem during President Biden's inauguration. Isabel Wilkerson, who is the author of Caste, See Oprah's Book Club, and Warmth of Other Suns, first Black American woman to win the Pulitzer Prize in journalism. John A. Powell, UC Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute, an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. And Douglas Blackman, American writer, 2009 Pulitzer Prize winner for his book entitled Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. Now, one of the questions that does tend to come up about this happening on the state level, it seems like to me, this may be done faster on the local level than the national level. But I do understand also that by trying to implement this in California, that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to have reparations on the national level, correct?
Yes, and the statute that the California Reparations Task Force is based on, AB 3121, there's a provision that states, you know, in the event that California actually meets out reparations to African Americans, that does not preempt preempt the federal government's role. So the federal government still has the responsibility to pay reparations to African Americans on the federal level. And many reparationists in the reparation space still maintain that reparations is first and foremost a federal responsibility. And so, you know, in the event that these different reparations task forces and committees are popping up across the local and state level, you know, the argument is that, you know, they could be helpful, particularly in the push for federal reparations. Other than that, it can get a little messy, as you see all these different committees are having all these different kind of, well, yeah, so.
I know that Evanston, Illinois had announced some type of reparations that they had planned as well. But as I looked further into it, it seemed like that was more like a housing initiative per se. But for those who are not aware, this was recently announced. I don't know how many people know about this. But speaking of California, San Francisco has a reparation panel that is pitching $5 million each to Black residents. Camilla, I want to get your take on this because I know I said this to you and I was like, I don't know if you've seen this, but how do you feel about this? What San Francisco is proposing?
No, I'm still looking into it. They submitted a draft report in December, actually, but it's just now kind of hitting the news. And so San Francisco, the African American Reparations Advisory Committee has until June to actually finalize their proposal. So no, I'm just going to wait and see. But it's very interesting. I'm starting to kind of realize what many experts in the reparation space, particularly Dr. Darity, is saying in terms of sometimes these different, you know, city, municipal efforts can kind of be a distraction towards the real prize, which is the federal goal. But that's not to say that, you know, states and localities and municipalities cannot atone for any particular specific state or local sanctioned atrocities against the African American community. I think there's definitely space for that, which is why the California Reparations Task Force exists.
Correct. They say here a lump sum payment would compensate the affected population and will redress the economic and opportunity losses that Black San Franciscans have endured collectively as the result of both intentional decisions and unintended harms perpetuated by city policy. So this is another thing I wanted to talk to you about too, because a lot of times when we mention reparations, people think we're only referring to slavery. We're only referring to the 40 acres and a mule, but they don't think about the fact that Jim Crow is also a part of this as well. All of the laws that were imposed on Black people because of Jim Crow, that's also a part of it. I would also add in the crime bills that happened under Joe Biden. There's so much more that goes into this and not just slavery, but I wanted to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, and the way I frame it is that, slavery is absolutely the foundation. So, when we're talking about reparations, slavery is the foundation, right? Our ancestors were forced to labor in this country for 250 years. Not only, and this is, information that we revealed through our study, through our public hearings, right? Not only were our ancestors, traded like, commodities for their physical attributes, but a lot of people don't really understand that, we were actually traded for our intellectual abilities because our skills, right? Plantations were the mega corporations of their time, right? They capitalized on cash crops. They needed to get people who had the skills, cultivation skills, right? People were already cultivating to a certain extent rice and other crops on the coast of Africa, right? And so when we talk about slavery, right, that it was, the United States was built off, that institution, right? Built off of our ancestors. So that's definitely the foundation. But to your point, right, there are these in our historic 500-page interim report that we released in June, and you can find on our website, oag.ca.gov/AB3121. There's 13 chapters, right? The first chapter is an introduction. The second is a chapter on enslavement, but the remaining chapters we define as, the 12 major areas of, in layman's terms, systemic discrimination, but really 12 badges and incidents of slavery that still linger on and impact the African-American community post-emancipation, post the broken promise of Reconstruction, like racial terror, like political disenfranchisement, like mass incarceration and over-policing, the pathologizing of the Black family, and on and on and on. And the last chapter, 13th chapter, is on the wealth gap. Currently, it'll take over 228 years to close the wealth gap between African Americans and white Americans in this country.
Yes, and there's a question that came up. Who would pay these reparations? Taxpayers? ? That's a good question. How would they pay for it, Camilla? At least California.
So interestingly enough, the task force, we are meeting again in San Diego next week. And we actually have invited some tax experts to come and provide expert testimony around issues around tax. So again, this interview is me speaking personally, not speaking on behalf of the task force. But if folks are kind of interested in that question, I would say stay tuned and either come to our meeting in person or watch virtually.
Well said. Thank you so much for that. I want to talk about net worth and wealth for a second, because I don't think people understand just how devastating the racial wealth gap is in the United States. And The Guardian actually recently put out an article that I think everyone really needs to pay attention to. Now, I was surprised this came from The Guardian, but they said the median wealth of Black Americans will fall to 0 by 2053. So see, this is the thing. I think sometimes people hear reparations are like, oh, well, Black people just want you to give them cash. Like, I don't understand that. First of all, there's a couple of things that go into this. After slavery, General Sherman did promise Black Americans 40 acres and a mule. That did not happen. This is why we don't have generational wealth for the most part in this country. Now, you may find some Black families that did have that, but for the most part, none. We weren't given that opportunity. After slavery, when there was, I think this during the period of Reconstruction, please correct me if I'm wrong, Camilla, but there was a time in this country where Black communities actually did have that. They were starting their own businesses in their own communities. So the dollar constantly turned in the Black community. Those were known as the Black Wall Streets. A lot of people know about Tulsa, but there were multiple Black Wall Streets. What happened to those communities? They were burned to the ground. So that was kind of like our chance there to have that. And all of those communities were burned down. But the fact that Black Americans' net worth by 2053 could be 0, this is very concerning.
Absolutely. And, that data is reflected in our interim report, the 13th chapter in the wealth gap. And yes, I heard recently, like in a podcast or something like that, or the top 1% now own like 2/3 of the wealth. So just think about like where African Americans who descend from slaves kind of situate in that, right? Like by 2053, like, and people say that that's actually we're on an accelerated timeline to that zero wealth due to the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on our community. And so, reparations is long overdue. And, I personally see the California Reparations Task Force is hopefully, setting a precedent and sending a signal or a message to the federal government that, reparations is far overdue. Interestingly enough, I'll just conclude by saying when we did publish our historic interim report June of last year, 2022, literally on the first day, I don't know which journalist, but a journalist actually asked Biden's press secretary during the official press conference if they had heard of the California Reparations Task Force. Did they hear about this report that just came out? And so the federal government is aware of what the task force is doing. And so I think that's positive news. And hopefully, when we turn in that final report, that message is clear.
That's right. And for people who are not aware, I want to show this clip here. I've showed it on the show multiple times, but we have new viewers now. And I think people really need to see just how Black Americans were affected in this country. Now, this is called the unequal opportunity race. I just want to pause it here for a second to explain to people what's going on. The numbers that you see changing right here, those are the years going by. So as you can see, white Americans have already started the race and Black Americans are still waiting to start the race. Does everybody see that? That was generational wealth already being passed down. We haven't even made it to the 1900s yet. Being an educator, I have to pause here. Sorry, Camilla, and say this. Standardized tests are inherently racist and sexist. I'm sorry, I had to say that, Camilla.
No, I definitely are.
Yeah. And this is the end when it says affirmative action helps level the playing field. But affirmative action, as we know, can be a double-edged sword, right? It's like it can get you in the door, but then people can question whether or not you're really supposed to be there.
That's very true too. I've learned they're going to question no matter what. Like, for instance, affirmative action has been banned in California since Proposition 209, so at least 20 years ago. So, but still people think that Black people get into Berkeley and UCLA because of affirmative action, or Stanford because of affirmative action, when it's been banned for over 20 years. So, I don't know, it's interesting.
That's right. There's a question here for you, Camilla. Thank you so much for the super chat, One Tall Girl. Discuss proposed repairs for the injustices to slaves and the associated descendant groups based on U.S. slave practices and policies that impacted state law, starting from the joining Cal State to the U.S. to present day.
Yeah, that's a pretty loaded question. I'm happy to do that. One Tall Girl, I'm also tall as well. So one of the, there's a whole bunch of preliminary recommendations in our interim report that we released June 2022. One of them being the creation of the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, which would be an agency that would, help to distribute reparations to the descendant community. Also, the task force has hired 5 people to serve on our economic consultant team to help the task force kind of ascertain what could potential compensation be for in the form of reparations for African Americans for particular state sanctioned atrocities or crimes, like California's role in housing discrimination and houselessness is one of the state sanctioned crimes that The Economist identified. There's also mass incarceration and over policing is the second, right? Health harms is the third, and notably in the video you just showed, it showed how African Americans have a shortened lifespan. And so The Economist, for instance, just to illustrate the point, right, gathered data and evidence to come up with a potential calculation for what African Americans are owed due to the life gap between African Americans and European Americans in this country. So health harms is the third. And then the fourth type of state sanctioned atrocity that The Economists are studying, trying to identify a potential calculation figure for is unjust property taken. So think about what happened with Bruce Beach, for instance, right? There's many instances of African Americans, their homes, their places of business, right, being disproportionately taken via a disproportionate use of eminent domain to our communities, highways and things like that. And then lastly, to conclude, the fifth state-sanctioned atrocity, the economists are working on trying to identify a number for potential compensation is devaluation of Black businesses. So I'll just say one last thing on this question, because it's like a loaded question, but one of the mandates of the task force is to ensure that whatever our final recommendations are comport with international human rights law standards. And so I'm an attorney, I studied human rights law. And so under international law, there are 5 forms of reparations, right? Compensation or cash payments is one of those forms. And so that's why we hired those 5-member economic consultant team to help us identify what could reparations look like in the form of cash payments, right? And that's how they identified those 5 harms. But then also under international law, there is restitution. So that accounts for stolen land, stolen wealth, stolen labor, stolen property, real or even intellectual. Then there's also rehabilitation. So that could look like, free, medical care, health care, trauma services, mental health care. Satisfaction is a 4th form of reparations under international law. So that gets at more symbolic forms like, the renaming of streets or the taking down of Confederate monuments, things like that. And then lastly, the 5th form of reparations is guarantees of non-repetition, right? Cessation of the injury or the harm. So that gets into more conversations about structural institutional policy change. Since I'm in this forum, I'll even say things like abolition, for instance, right? That is a topic that is very closely related.
That's right. Camilla, I have well, actually two more questions for you. What's
Yeah.
your take on the HR 40 bill that's been sitting in the House for years? Do you feel that that goes far enough? Because I've heard Jim Clyburn talk about this. He said, of course, I'm for reparations. I interviewed Rokana about this, and he said, well, yes, I agree with HR 40, but that bill has not been brought to the floor for a vote.
Yeah, right. You're right. I think they've reintroduced it for this, legislative session. It did not pass both chambers in the past. Well, since it's been introduced in the 80s. And, I'll just say AB 3121 is, based on HR 40. Much of the language is very, very similar, right? So if HR 40 passed, right, they would be doing work similar to what the task force is already doing. And so to that end, I generally, like, again, this is me speaking personally, not on behalf of the task force or anything. Like, I generally support, obviously, reparations legislation on the federal level. But at this point, because of the work that the task force is doing, I'm like, there could be some executive action at this point, right? Like, so I don't know.
100%. Michael, thank you for this super chat. Why not cash reparations immediately in California? Well, I think that's what San Francisco is looking to do right now. Michael, you might have came in later, but San Francisco, I know, announced that they're looking to pay like $5 million towards African Americans. But that's a good question. Camilla, I'll direct that to you.
Well, I mean, it is a good question. And for instance, in the preliminary recommendation to create a California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, like in this hypothetical agency, there would be like an office of immediate relief so that for those who are in immediate need can get their needs taken care of. But I think to the point you're making, the person who asked the question, there are some preliminary recommendations, again, in that interim report that the task force released June 2022. California state legislators, they have recently, got back into session. And so they're starting to, come up with their, legislation. And so, technically, they could figure out how to, incorporate some preliminary recommendations into their legislation, although, no preliminary recommendations related to cash were in the report. So I think maybe people are just kind of waiting to see what the task force comes up with in June of this year.
Okay, and here's another question from Danny. Thank you for the super chat. Should certain African nations also be obligated to contribute to reparations for their role in the transatlantic slave trade? That's an interesting question.
What do you think? What do you think? I'm curious.
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't so much like they had a choice. I think people should understand that. And then another question that comes up, kind of to go along with this, Prince Harry came out recently and said that, England should pay reparations to the Caribbean countries, right? Because they stole wealth from those countries and their role in the slave trade in those particular countries. So this goes along with another question people have asked me before, like, but what about people in Haiti and the Bahamas, all the other like Caribbean countries? Like, shouldn't they get reparations too? And you feel free to correct me on this, but my impression is that France would be the one to pay reparations to Haiti. And so England would be the one to pay reparations to the Bahamas, Barbados, as Prince Harry was saying. But I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I'll answer that part and then come back to the question. So Caribbean nations, they currently have a federation called CARICOM. And one of the dictates of CARICOM is to, lobby, their former colonial masters for, reparations. So that federation has existed for some time now, and they're accelerating their efforts as well. And I think even partnering with the African Union in some instances as well. I believe the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, is the chair of the Reparations Commission for CARICOM. So they definitely have some great leadership. And I agree personally that, you know, you know, we all have our different claims. We all need to hold these European nations accountable for, and America, for their role. And so, to your point, yes, Haitians, you know, the claim is to France, Jamaica, the claim is to the Crown. And so forth and so forth. But to answer the question around African nations, like I have a very brief but kind of complex response to that, right? I do not think that African nations as they exist today have the same responsibility as European nations as they exist today to you know, reparations for descendants of slaves because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. Because, you know, the African nations as that exist today, they did not exist during the slave trade, right? There were particular in specific African kingdoms, yes, that did have some role in trading human beings to the transatlantic slave trade. That is a historical fact. But for instance, you know, Cameroon or Nigeria or, you know, Ghana as they exist today, you know, these are, you know, nations based on, you know, colonial dictates from the Berlin Conference of, you know, the 1888, like that the way they're structured today, they had nothing to do with it, right? But I think, you know, to the extent that, you know, African kingdoms that still exist right today want to account in some way or another for their role, there is space for that. I think in the reparation space, if it's like truth and healing and reconciliation, we always think about that in the American context, but what does that look like in the context of Africans and African descendants, you know, something like that. I think could be fruitful, but also I'll just conclude. I had a meeting recently with some activists from Namibia who reached out wanting to information share about you know, their fight for reparations against Germany for the genocide that they experienced in 1903. And, you know, one of the conversation points was, you know, what are the expectations of the African Union potentially to the African American community when it comes to customs or trade, for instance, right? So, you know, I think there is some willingness, I think, for the African Union to kind of be a part of the conversation and be like, okay, how can, you know, we you know, atone or, you know, nothing's wrong with that, having a conversation with African Americans about like, how can we kind of open up to you and acknowledgement of kind of like that, the past. But no, we cannot, that's dangerous territory to say, yeah, African nations owe, you know, compensation and all these other things for their role in slavery. That's like a historical misnomer. The responsibility is to these European nations that exist now and existed then. So.
Yeah, and those nations also had the power. Thank you for the super chat, Lorez. Also, no Fed home loans in the 30s, no GI Bill for Black military. Yeah, that's another thing that comes up too, especially when we talk about the I was about to say the Green New Deal. When we talk about the New Deal, how I did a whole show about that, of how Black families were left out of certain parts of the New Deal as well. Redlining goes along with that also. And I want to get your take on this, Camilla, about economic universal programs. So a lot of the people that are watching came from the Bernie Sanders movement, not so much a part of that movement anymore. You know, there's been a lot of disappointment that has gone that way. But one of the things that Bernie Sanders really advocated for was, if you give people these universal programs, then that'll lift everyone up out of poverty and we'll all be on a level playing field. But what we found over time is that the data shows and the research shows that that's not true for African Americans, because we're already behind our white peers. Even with those universal programs, we still won't be on the same level playing field as white Americans in this country. And I want to get your take about that. Like when people say universal health care and free pre-K, like I'm for all those things. But I want people to understand that still doesn't level the playing field when we talk about racial wealth gap in this country.
Yeah, I think you kind of said it better than I could. And I think the video you showed also illustrated it. Like there's a distinction between equality and equity. And, you know, equality isn't enough. You know, like there needs to be real intentionality around like what does equity look like in this country, right? How, like Martin Luther King said, how do you account for, you know, no one, no other ethnic group has been enslaved on American soil to the scale and the mass of the African American community. And so there needs to be equity, real equity, to atone and repair and rectify that crime against humanity. So I agree.
That's right. And one last one for you. This is from Roger Meadows. Thanks for the super chat. Tell them about the Freedmen's Bureau Bank, Camilla.
Oh, well, actually, AJ Plus, they have a really good educational video about the history of the Freedmen's Bank. It was there was a short, brief period of Reconstruction in this country, as you all know, right after the Civil War, the Union won. Abraham Lincoln, passed. For signed legislation to create, the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Bank. It was ran by white people. They were very shoddy and essentially like stole these newly freed slaves' money. Like these people, my ancestors, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, just a quick aside, they're currently transcribing, right, documents as we speak from the Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau. So if you're African American, you got to get into your genealogy, because you could find that, for instance, your ancestor or family member submitted some savings into that bank. But yeah, the bank was closed. Was closed after a number of years, after infidelity. There was no FDIC at the time, for instance. And so, like our ancestors went through a lot. And so, yeah, that's the history of the bank. So yeah, Google it, look up AJ Plus. But yeah, just to conclude, there was a brief period of Reconstruction in this country. We had the Freedmen's Bank, the Freedmen's Bureau, helping newly freed African slaves transition from slavery to freedom. That was all rescinded after the assassination of Lincoln, with the emergence of Andrew Johnson. And the rest is history, with the Compromise of 1876. And so, yeah, and after that, the Republicans, made a compromise with the Democrats not to enforce Reconstruction in the South, kind of left our ancestors for dead. And Freedmen's Bank history is kind of wrapped up in that, and how it was destroyed.
That's right. That's right. And I think there's one more or two more. I think I know the answer to this. Michael, thank you for this. More, do you personally support cash reparations? I believe you do, right, Camilla?
Yeah, I do, from a scholarly perspective, in that under international human rights law, reparations come in 5 forms. And so my personal opinion is that you can't call any program for reparations unless it includes all 5 of those forms. So yes.
That's right. And last one, thank you for this, tall girl. What are your thoughts on multi-generational Black Americans that are descendants of slaves and freedmen being its own federally recognized racial group? Interesting question.
No, that's a really interesting question. And there are people in the reparations space that have actually recently met with the Office of Management and Budget, right? They're the ones who operate the U.S. Census in this country. And there is a push to have freedmen be a category there, with the caveat that freedmen isn't a racial classification, it's a political classification. It's it's a status based on those who were descendants of slaves in this country. So yeah, to your point, there is some work to get some federal recognition, or re-recognition, because it's already been recognized federally just over 100 years ago, but it never really went away. And so yeah, there is a grassroots movement to get some re-recognition of the freedman identity on a federal level, as a political status or classification rather than a racial one per se.
Well said. And I'm gonna leave you with this, Camilla. One of the questions that continues to come up as well. I know I've told you last question like multiple times, but one of the questions that tends to come up as well is what about indigenous people? What about those who had their land stolen? What about those groups? And I've had this conversation before with the Colonized Buffalo podcast, as well as Delija, who is also indigenous. She ran for governor in Texas as a Green Party candidate. And the response that they gave to me is that they're not asking for reparations; they're asking for something different. So, what do you say? What do you say to people who ask that question? Well, what about indigenous people as well?
Well, when I went to law school, like not only did I study like human rights law, so I have a Master of Laws in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam. That was through a study abroad program, but I went to Columbia Law School in New York City. And so one of my extracurricular activities, I was not only an executive board member for the Black Law Student Association. A lot of people don't know this, but I was also an executive board member for the Native American Law Student Association. And I'm not Native American, but I do consider myself to be generally an ally. And I was also interested in learning about tribal law. Participated in a tribal law moot court competition, right? Because I was interested to see what are the parallels and the distinctions between these two groups. And to your point, what that person said in the podcast is what I've heard as well, where Native Americans aren't necessarily requesting or advocating for reparations, right? They're advocating for their treaty rights to be respected and enforced. They're asking for their sovereignty rights to be enforced, right? So Native Americans, the federally recognized ones, they're considered domestic dependent nations, yet they're sovereign entities. And so that's first and foremost what they're concerned about is their sovereignty, right? Whereas the African American political project around reparations, whether people like it or not, is really about that, nearly 400 plus year political project of our citizenship rights being respected, right? In the last, 100 something years, it's about, our full citizenship rights around the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment being fully respected in this country. So they're really two different political fights. So it's really a false dichotomy when people pit African American descendants of slaves and Native Americans against each other in the context of reparations. Because again, Native Americans are fighting for their sovereignty. African Americans through reparations are fighting for full citizenship under the law, right? That's a political project that our ancestors who were enslaved started. And so there is a distinction. I will say, though, California has a Truth in Healing Council that the governor, Gavin Newsom, signed through an executive order 2019. And so they have until 2025 to come up with reparations proposals for California natives. So, California, we're doing what we can. Like, there is no competition. There shouldn't be a competition. The last thing I'll say, though, is, right, not all Native American, tribes are the same, and we can't flatten that experience. There are some Native American tribes who actually enslaved Black people, African people, who have, were participated in slave catching, for instance, right? When we talk about the 5 civilized tribes or so, they got that identity as civilized tribes from Europeans because they participated in slavery. And if you read some books like Indian Masters, Black Slaves, you'll learn that some of these tribes were just as torturous to their African descendants slaves as white people, burned them alive and all of that. And so, history is deep, history is messy, and, it doesn't serve anyone to, flatten experiences and kind of not get into those details. So, but yeah, I'm in solidarity with the Native American community by and large, and there is no competition amongst us in terms of reparations. You can support Native American sovereignty and reparations for the African American community at the same time.
Well said. Thank you so much, Camilla. Where can people go to find you and your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Camila V. Moore, Kamilah V as in Victoria Moore. You can find me on my website, CamilaMoore.com. I have a contact page and you can reach me there as well. If folks want to learn more about the task force, they can go to our website at oag.ca.gov/AB 3121. We have a meeting coming up next week. As I said, you can watch virtually or attend in person. Public comment is from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Both days, 27th and 28th. So that's a Friday and a Saturday. You can email the task force anytime with your thoughts, with your proposals. We do read the emails. You can call us as well. Our email is reparationstaskforce@doj.ca.gov. So, and you can also check out our interim report. It's, nearly 500 pages, but it's an amazing resource. And one of the task force members on our, commission, Don Tamaki, he was one of the main people responsible for helping to get Japanese Americans reparations for internment. He, has gone on to say that this report that we just released, June 2022, is the most comprehensive report on, the African American community, the contributions, and the oppression we faced since the 1968 Kerner Commission, which released a report soon after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., after the nation erupted. And so the Kerner Commission predicted that, to conclude, conditions would worsen for the African American community if there weren't some intervention from the government on this issue. And they were right, especially when we look at the reckoning that occurred in 2020 after unjust murder of George Floyd. Today, right, police have killed more people this past year than they've killed in the past 20 years. And so things have gotten necessarily worse in some instances for the African American community. African Americans in LA, right, are less likely to own a home today than they were in the 1930s. Right. So we're under this false illusion of that we're in a post-racial society. When we really, unveil that curtain, you'll understand that, we still have a lot of work to do. And that's why reparations is vastly important. And that's why people need to stay engaged and support this effort.
That's right. Well, Camilla, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.